didn't wake up one morning and suddenly discover a new enemy on its southern flank. What Moscow is facing is far more uncomfortable than that. It's a slow, deliberate military rise that cannot be threatened away, sanctioned away, or reversed with force. And it's happening inside NATO, right on the western edge of the Black Sea. Romania's military transformation is not loud. It isn't theatrical. It doesn't rely on one wonder weapon or a single headline-grabbing purchase. That's exactly why it's becoming a serious problem for Russia. Because what Romania is building isn't just a stronger national military. It's becoming a system node inside NATO's Eastern defense architecture. And systems are much harder to intimidate than countries. For most of the post-Cold War era, Moscow treated Romania as strategically secondary, not weak, but not decisive, a state focused on internal reform, EU integration, and economic development rather than power projection. That assumption no longer holds. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Romania has moved faster and more consistently than many NATO members on the eastern flank. According to NATO defense expenditure reports and Romania's Ministry of Defense data, Bucharest has sustained defense spending at or above the alliance's 2% guideline in recent years, while directing an unusually large share of that budget toward procurement rather than personnel or administration. That distinction matters because procurement shapes future capability, not just present readiness. Romania is not trying to look strong. It is trying to become structurally indispensable. And that creates a challenge Russia has struggled with repeatedly since the war began. Moscow is effective at pressuring individual states. It is far less effective at disrupting deeply integrated military ecosystems. That distinction sits at the heart of why Romania's rise matters. This is not about Romania defeating Russia in a direct fight. No serious analyst claims that. What concerns Russian planners is that Romania increasingly enables NATO to operate faster, see deeper, and stay longer in the Black Sea region. According to NATO command statements and reporting from outlets such as Reuters and Defense News, alliance planners now treat southeastern Europe not as a loose buffer zone, but as a continuous operational space stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Romania sits directly on that axis, and that changes everything. Unlike frontline states that rely primarily on reinforcements arriving after a crisis begins, Romania is increasingly positioned as a place where forces can already be present, already supported, and already integrated into NATO command structures before tensions escalate. This represents a different model of deterrence. Instead of reacting to pressure, the alliance is embedding resilience in advance. Russia understands deterrence well, but this kind of deterrence is harder to probe. You cannot test it with a single provocation. You cannot isolate it diplomatically, and you cannot remove it without escalating against multiple NATO members simultaneously. That is the strategic trap Romania creates. What makes this especially uncomfortable for Moscow is that Romania's rise does not hinge on any single capability Russia can easily target or neutralize. There is no lone base whose destruction would collapse the system, no single procurement program whose delay would halt momentum, no political lever that would suddenly reverse alignment. Instead, Romania is building layered strength. Military modernization, infrastructure expansion, logistics integration, industrial rebuilding, intelligence cooperation. Each layer reinforces the others, and each layer tightens NATO's posture along the western Black Sea. Russian analysts writing in military journals and cited by European security institutes have increasingly described the Black Sea as shifting from a permissive environment into a contested one. Not because of a sudden explosion in firepower, but because of improved surveillance, faster response timelines, and tighter coordination among NATO members. Romania plays a central role in all three. From Moscow's perspective, this creates a long-term problem rather than an immediate crisis. There is no single red line to cross, no dramatic escalation to exploit, just a steady narrowing of options. And that narrowing is occurring while Russia remains heavily committed in Ukraine. Ukraine, investing enormous resources into sustaining combat operations while managing sanctions, industrial strain, and manpower pressures, documented by organizations such as the Institute for the Study of War and the Royal United Services Institute. Romania's rise adds another variable Russia must account for, another direction demanding attention, another region where freedom of maneuver is shrinking. That is why this story matters now. Not because Romania is preparing for war, but because it is preparing for permanence. And permanence is far more dangerous to Russia's strategy than short-term shows of force. To understand why Romania's rise matters, you have to stop thinking in terms of borders and start thinking in terms of systems. For decades, Russia treated the Black Sea as a space it could dominate through proximity alone. Crimea anchored naval power. Long-range air defenses extended coverage outward. Naval patrols and intelligence assets operated with relative freedom. Even after NATO enlargement, Moscow assumed the Western Black Sea would remain a secondary theater. That assumption has eroded quietly and steadily. Romania sits directly across from Crimea, controls the mouths of the Danube River, and borders Moldova, including the Russian-backed enclave of Transnistria. Strategically, this places Romania at the intersection of maritime access, riverine logistics, and southeastern land corridors. Geography alone makes Romania relevant. What makes it problematic for Russia is how that geography is now being activated. Since 2022, NATO has expanded surveillance, air policing, and maritime monitoring across the Black Sea region. According to NATO Air Command briefings and reporting by Reuters, Romanian-based radar coverage, patrol aircraft, and intelligence feeds are now deeply integrated into alliance-wide systems, tracking Russian air and naval activity in near real time. Activity once visible primarily to Russian commanders is now shared almost immediately across NATO planning networks. The war in Ukraine accelerated this shift. When Russian drones began striking Ukrainian port infrastructure along the Danube, several incidents resulted in drones crossing into Romanian airspace or debris landing on Romanian territory. These incidents were confirmed by Romania's Ministry of Defense and reported by the Associated Press and Reuters. Romania was no longer merely adjacent to the war, it was being physically touched by it. Instead of pulling back, Romania tightened integration with NATO's integrated air and missile defense system. Sensor coverage expanded, air defense readiness increased, coordination with allied command centers deepened. From Moscow's perspective, ambiguity diminished. Operations near Ukraine's southern flank could no longer be assumed to remain compartmentalized. Every launch and flight path near the western Black Sea now carried a higher likelihood of immediate detection and attribution. This alters behavior. Analysts at the European Union Institute for Security Studies and RUESI have long argued that increased transparency reduces tactical surprise while increasing strategic predictability. That dynamic strengthens deterrence, but complicates pressure-based strategies. Romania contributes directly to that transparency. The same logic applies at sea. Romania does not need a large fleet to shape the Black Sea environment. It needs denial capability, coastal surveillance, secure ports, and integration with allied maritime forces. Ukraine's success against Russian naval assets using land-based missiles and drones in 2023 and 2024 demonstrated this reality clearly, a lesson emphasized in NATO after action assessments and open-source naval analysis. Modern sea control is about sensors and threat zones, not fleet size. Romania is building exactly that. As coastal defenses modernize and naval partnerships deepen, the Western Black Sea becomes increasingly constrained for Russian surface operations. Routes become more predictable. Safe operating space shrinks. Reaction times shorten. For the Kremlin, this is a structural problem. Russia's southern strategy depends on the Black Sea Fleet's freedom of movement. Every limitation imposed on that freedom ripples outward, affecting operations in Crimea, leverage in the Balkans, and influence over Moldova. Romania sits at the center of that pressure triangle. The Danube adds another layer. The river is not merely commercial infrastructure. It is a strategic logistics corridor linking Central Europe to the Black Sea. NATO planners and EU defense mobility initiatives have increasingly prioritized inland waterways and rail corridors as critical components of rapid reinforcement. Romania's control of the Danube Delta and investment in dual-use infrastructure mean NATO reinforcement routes into southeastern Europe are becoming faster and more resilient. brilliant. That undermines one of Russia's long-standing advantages, the ability to delay access. When reinforcement is slow, pressure works. When reinforcement is predictable and fast, pressure loses value. Romania's role in enabling that speed elevates it from a regional actor to a strategic constraint. Now we need to talk about the part of the map that turns this from a geographic headache into a strategic pressure cooker. Moldova, and the line that runs through it, Transnistria. Russia's problem with Romania becomes far more serious when you follow the river upstream. Not the Black Sea this time, the Danube. Because the Danube is not just a river, it is a logistics artery, a political boundary, and a pressure corridor that runs straight into one of Moscow's most sensitive gray zones. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Danube Delta has shifted from a commercial waterway into a strategic fault line. Russian drone and missile strikes on Ukrainian ports such as Reni and Izmail brought the war to the edge of NATO territory. In multiple documented incidents, drone debris landed inside Romania. These were confirmed by Romania's Ministry of Defense and widely reported by international outlets. That moment mattered because it meant Russia was no longer operating near NATO borders in theory, but in practice. Explosions were visible from Romanian towns. Air defense alerts became routine. What had once been peripheral suddenly became immediate. From Moscow's perspective, this created an escalation trap it did not necessarily want, because directly across that stretch of water sits NATO territory, and any further spillover risks responses that Russia cannot easily localize or control. But the Danube problem does not stop at the waterline. Upstream lies Moldova, one of the most geopolitically fragile states in Europe. Inside Moldova sits Transnistria, a Russian-backed separatist region that has hosted a long-standing Russian military presence since the 1990s. Western security studies, OSINT analysis, and repeated diplomatic reporting have long described Transnistria as both a leverage point and a liability for Moscow. The key issue is geography. Transnistria is isolated. It has no direct land connection to Russia. For years, Moscow's influence depended on political pressure, energy leverage, and indirect access. After 2022, that situation became even more constrained. Here's the uncomfortable strategic question Russia cannot avoid. If Moscow ever tried to expand its control in southern Ukraine in a way that created a land corridor toward Transnistria, even partially, the regional balance would shift dramatically. European security analysts have repeatedly described any scenario that physically links Russian-controlled territory toward Moldova as a major escalation risk, because it would place Russian power directly up against NATO's border along the Danube. And that border is Romania's. This is why Romania's military rise is not viewed in isolation by Moscow. It is viewed in context. A stronger Romania means a harder boundary around Moldova. It means less freedom to maneuver diplomatically, militarily, and economically in southeastern Europe. It also means that any instability in Moldova increasingly intersects with NATO planning and NATO surveillance. Romania has reinforced this reality through posture and policy. It has strengthened surveillance along the Danube, increased air defense readiness in the region, and deepened coordination with NATO monitoring networks. The practical effect is simple. The margin for ambiguity shrinks. From Russia's perspective, this closes off options. Pressure on Moldova becomes riskier. Coercive signaling becomes harder. Hybrid tactics face faster detection, and the margin for miscalculation gets thinner in a place where Moscow historically relied on gray zone leverage. The Danube becomes a line Russia cannot play around casually. Now that is the political and geographic layer, but the part Russia finds even harder to deal with is what comes next. Sustainment, industry, endurance, because Russia can adapt to weapons. It struggles far more with systems that can endure. This is where Romania's rise becomes truly uncomfortable for Moscow, because beyond tanks, jets, and bases lies something far harder to counter: sustainability. For much of the post-Cold War period, Romania's defense industry was a shadow of its former self. Production lines aged, ammunition capacity was limited, maintenance relied heavily on foreign suppliers. That vulnerability mattered in peacetime, but it becomes dangerous in a prolonged crisis. The war in Ukraine exposed that reality across Europe. Modern wars are not won by first strikes. They are won by who can keep producing, repairing, and supplying when the initial shock fades. Romania has taken that lesson seriously. Since 2022, Bucharest has accelerated a quiet but structural rebuild of its defense industrial base. This is not a single project, it is an approach. Romanian government releases, European defense industrial reporting, and EU-linked programs have pointed to investments in ammunition production, explosives manufacturing, vehicle maintenance capacity, and domestic assembly tied to foreign partnerships. Ammunition and propellant are the clearest signal. Romania has moved toward rebuilding domestic production capacity for key inputs, including gunpowder and ammunition, in part because the Ukraine war has shown that stockpiles disappear faster than procurement cycles can replace them. A country that can support its own sustained operations is far harder to pressure than one that depends entirely on external supply. Maintenance is another layer that matters more than people realize. Romania is positioning itself to support the sustainment of NATO equipment on the eastern flank. In simple terms, the closer the repair and maintenance pipeline is to the operational theater, the faster forces return to readiness. Western military logistics assessments routinely emphasize that repair cycles are combat power. A tank that cannot be repaired is not a tank. It is a parked liability. Russia understands this logic. Its own experience in Ukraine has repeatedly shown how quickly combat power degrades when repair, supply, and training pipelines become strained. Romania's shift towards sustainment capacity makes it more valuable to NATO and more difficult for Russia to outlast. Infrastructure ties directly into this. Romania sits on major mobility corridors in southeastern Europe, including key rail and road routes connecting Central Europe to the Black Sea. EU defense mobility initiatives have supported upgrades intended to allow heavy equipment to move faster across European territory. These are dual-use projects, meaning they benefit civilian economies, but they also support military movement when needed. In a crisis, Romania becomes a conduit. That matters for deterrence because speed reduces temptation. If reinforcements arrive quickly, escalation becomes less attractive. Then there is energy. Romania is one of the few countries in the region with meaningful domestic energy production and expanding offshore potential in the Black Sea, which has been widely discussed in European energy policy analysis. Russia has historically used energy dependence as leverage. Romania's position weakens that tool, not only for itself, but for parts of southeastern Europe connected through infrastructure and markets. This doesn't mean Romania is immune to pressure, no country is. But it does mean one of Russia's classic levers in Europe is less effective here than in many other places. And now comes the layer that turns all of this from capability into leverage, intelligence. Since 2022, NATO has intensified intelligence sharing across the southeastern flank. Romania plays a growing role as a monitoring hub for Russian air, naval, and drone activity in the Black Sea. NATO statements and open-source reporting have pointed to increased ISR presence in the region, including radar coverage, maritime patrol activity, and persistent monitoring of the operating environment. This does not mean constant confrontation, it means transparency. For Russia, transparency is a problem. It limits surprise, it shortens reaction time, and it exposes patterns, which is one of the fastest ways to reduce freedom of maneuver. A Black Sea where Russia is watched more consistently is a Black Sea where Russia has to assume its moves are being observed, interpreted, and integrated into NATO planning. So when you zoom out, the point becomes clear. Romania's rise does not mean war is inevitable. It does not mean Russia intends to attack, and it does not mean NATO seeks confrontation, but it does mean the strategic environment has shifted. Russia now faces a NATO state on its southern flank that is modernizing steadily, hosting allied activity, strengthening infrastructure, rebuilding industrial capacity, improving sustainment, and embedding itself deeper into alliance systems. This is not a temporary surge driven by panic. It is a long-term realignment. For Moscow, that removes flexibility. The Black Sea is no longer a space where Russia can operate with comfortable depth. Moldova is no longer a pressure point that can be manipulated without wider consequences. The Danube is no longer a soft boundary, and southeastern Europe is no longer a secondary theater. Romania has become a hinge, a country that connects land, sea, air, logistics, industry, energy, and intelligence into a coherent platform. Not loudly, not provocatively, but persistently. That is why its military rise is a problem for Russia. Not because it threatens invasion, but because it constrains options. And in geopolitics, losing options is often more dangerous than losing territory. The Black Sea calculus has changed, quietly, structurally, and likely for decades to come. This video is based on open source reporting and analysis, not official government assessments. And some future capabilities discussed are contingent on procurement timelines, training, and delivery schedules.